Hi, I'm Sarah Healy from Tools for Better, and this is our third webinar in the DEI Talk series. We were originally supposed to do this on women's sport, and don't worry, we'll definitely get to that. But first of all, we wanted to shine a light on the broader implications of gender-based violence and hear from experts from across the globe. This is a topic that is top of mind for all the wrong reasons, and in recent months we've seen a series of high-profile cases involving violence against women. Unfortunately, these seemingly watershed moments are just the most recent in a global epidemic of gender violence that requires awareness, education, and action. This webinar, just as a quick content warning, addresses themes such as domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence and may not be suitable for all audiences. If you feel you need support, we've included some contact details throughout. Hopefully you'll find this conversation useful. And now over to Brady to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that insightful introduction. Today we're going to be talking about the reality of violence against women. I'm your host, Brady Cook, and I'm a member of the team Tools for Better. And yes, that's an accent you hear. I'm from the States, and I just graduated with a degree in sociology and human rights. I have 4 amazing sisters, and 1 in 5 women are victims of gender-based violence. So this topic is something I understand from an academic standpoint, but also lived experience. Let me introduce our panel. First up, we have Deirdre Campbell. Deirdre is a gender equality advocate with 30 years of professional experience, having trained and worked as a nurse and midwife. Deirdre went on to dedicate over 20 years working directly to address domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence in over 20 countries, before transitioning into her current career role focused on diversity, equality, and inclusion within a political party. Welcome, Deirdre.
Thank you, Brady.
Next, we have Reggie Wingo. Reggie is the prevention team leader and outreach educator for the Elizabeth Freeman Center in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. He has spent more than a decade educating middle, high school, and college students on cultivating healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, sex education, bystander response, social responsibility, and culture and gender norms. He also runs the programs Undoing White Supremacy, Holding Space, and Dialogues Across Differences with the organization Growing a New Heart. Welcome, Reggie.
Thank you, Brady.
So let's jump right in. To kick us off, Reggie, what were your motivations with regards to preventing violence against women?
Oh, well, to be completely honest, when I was a young adult in my, later teens, early 20s, I hung out with a bunch of really, really misogynistic dudes. Like, American society raises us that way on purpose. And at 22, I found out that my partner at the time was having a baby. And then I found out that that baby was a female identified one. And it really made me take a good, hard, long look at the way me and my friends conducted ourselves. And like you, Brady, I have 6 sisters. And 4 of them have been survivors of domestic violence. So that really made me really want to actively do something about it besides just changing myself and my behaviors.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Deirdre, your career has taken you across the globe. Was there any particular moment that triggered your commitment to gendered violence?
Yeah, so I suppose in what I call my grown-up years, I've come to know that I'm absolutely driven by injustice. I rail against injustice in all its forms. And when I see it, when I experience it, when I hear it, it just ignites a fierce anger in me. So in my earlier years, that anger found it difficult to find a space, but over the years, I've come to work with that anger and seek to transform it into compassion and action in support of survivors of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. I see gender inequality as an absolute injustice, and I understand gender-based violence as the ultimate manifestation of the gender hierarchy that places women as less equal to men in our society. As for a particular moment, I do remember, and I remember it vividly. It was 1993 in Ireland, which seems like a long time ago, but it's not. It was a young woman who bravely stood up and stood out. Her name was Lavinia Kerwick. She waived her right to anonymity and went public about her rape. And in doing that, she challenged all of the systems. She did so because the judicial system had let her down. Her community, her society had all let her down. The narrative brought into victim blaming. It also brought into what we often call in Ireland the pillar of community narrative around the perpetrator, good person. And I remember I was a student nurse at the time, and I was on a phone home to my mother, and I could hear the gender biased norms coming through, and I couldn't reconcile that in my head with the mother I knew, who was compassionate, kind, always seeking to help people who in more vulnerable situations. So I guess that's what started my journey, a journey into finding out more about rape crisis services, looking to work with them, realizing that at the point in time I could work really only by shaking buckets and raising money. I couldn't work directly with survivors, and a journey of challenging the social norms and narratives and standing up and railing against this at all times. It got packed away then for a little while as my career went on. But then it got absolutely unpacked in 2003, and it became the core focus of my work up until 2 years ago. So for over 20 years. In 2003, what ignited it was conflict-related sexual violence. I was working in West Darfur at the time, and something deeply uncomfortable in the narrative that was happening around why women experience sexual violence in conflict. It was a part of war. It was a tactic of war, and that didn't sit comfortably. And also the narrative by international actors that said, we must never let this happen again. And I found myself thinking back to 1994 and thinking, I'm sure I heard that narrative post-Rwanda genocide. So if you're saying it now, 2003, you're failing, something's not working. So yeah, that was what drove my core focus and my deepening of my commitment and my learning on it, and my whole journey to now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I can definitely relate to that anger as well. We've seen a lot of progress on the back of the Me Too movement in 2017. Yet we have seen recent instances of gendered violence in all forms of media in relation to the New York City street attacks that happened early this spring. What do you believe has contributed to the shift that has allowed such violence to become palatable?
Oh, I think that is such a layered question. I think over here on this side of the pond, I think we as a society are in a crisis of conscience, right? Like ever since the election of Trump, and the pandemic, and lots of things in that year really made a shift in just sort of the societal entitlement, and sort of there's this set of abusive values, just an underlying set of values, right? Like I can denigrate you or belittle you if you make me question my self-worth or self-ideal. You know what I mean? So I think that plays a large part. I also think on a much more fundamental level, I mean, for 15 years was working in high schools, middle schools, colleges, etc. And I would have a room full of students and I would be like, raise your hand if you've ever had a conversation about not going out by yourself at night, or how to keep your drink safe, or you know what I mean, anything like that. And every female identified hand in the room would go up. And then I'd be like, all right, so if you ever had a conversation with your parents, your pastor, whoever it may be, about consent and not assaulting someone and what consent really looks like, not many male-identified hands would go up. So I believe, at least here in America, we have an issue with we are not discussing with our young men about how to conduct themselves, right? So I think that's a large part of it on like a meta picture. But then I think in a sort of like micro look, I think a lot of men here in America still have a really hard time being vulnerable, really like looking at their emotions and being introspective, and really just having a general sense of respect. Like, again, like Deirdre was talking about, like this gender hierarchy, right? When you are taught from a very, very young age, low key, that like everything is kind of for you, right? That is going to manifest itself later in your life, right? When you, and like, especially like America, this like, it's sort of like a trickle down of the manifest destiny, right? I feel like male identified humans in America feel like on some level that they have a right to whatever they want and they will get it, right? And like how they get it is the issue.
Deirdre?
Yeah, I mean, so much similar. And I suppose what I'm maybe going to start with is, having worked across very different countries, I guess something that challenged me at one point in this journey was how similar the experiences are. From country to country, countries can be so vastly different, but actually violence against women shows up the same in every country and in every context. And that entitlement and privilege that you speak to, Reggie, is the underbelly of it always. Absolutely always. The way I kind of phrase it is, I believe that it happens because it can, because it's allowed. Perpetrators act in this way because they think they're entitled to do so. They fear little to no repercussions. And that leads them to take what they want, when they want, and how they want to. So language sometimes that we've used on it, and again, when I came to this language first, and it was something I kind of struggled with, but it's always their terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions can change, but they're always aimed at them getting what they want. And I think that that's really, really, yeah, it's tricky. And an inability to negotiate, and consent is predicated on negotiation, active and ongoing, consultation, what feels right, what doesn't feel right, what are you comfortable with? None of that is present where violence is happening. So it isn't. I think in terms of it manifesting in very public cases, and we've had public cases ourselves, they happen all the time. So they do. But I think that it has a very specific role in reinforcing the gender hierarchy. So if we think of the message that's conveyed from very public acts of this, number one, there's nearly a emboldenedness in it, because I even can do this in public because I fear so little the repercussions, and because I believe so much that I'm entitled to. That's what I hear in it. And I think the impact of that then is control of movement, safety. So immediately what will happen for me, if I speak about me as a woman living in Ireland, when there is a case of an assault, a murder within the public space, or in the public consciousness, even though it's been in the domestic space, I will question where it feels safe to go, when, with whom, how I'll go there, because that's programmed in me. So it is. It's programmed in me. And it's, again, when you work with survivors on this issue, you don't get rid of all those social narratives that you've grown up with. But what you get good at, and what's crucial in the work, is that you catch them as they come. So I remember when I started working on a confidential helpline. You'd pick up the phone, there were varied people, multiple different experiences. You might pick up the phone and you'd be listening, and you'd find that you can, really connect and empathize, which is essential to that. But then maybe a piece of the narrative, or of the story, I should say, might trigger something like, wish you weren't walking home after being in the pub on your own. And you go, whoa, because that's the victim blaming narrative. And then second to that is, if only she got a taxi. Just this last 2 weeks in Ireland, we've had the case of a taxi driver who's been convicted of sexually assaulting and raping women in his taxi. The problem when we take that focus on the survivor and on how women move in the world, where they move, and with whom and at what time and what they're wearing and all of those things that are shockingly still there within all of our consciousnesses, is that we omit to look at the fact that actually this isn't about what I choose to do. So maybe I go out and I choose to get a taxi home. That does not mean I'm any less at risk, because what we haven't actually looked at is the behaviour of the perpetrators here. We haven't looked at the accountability. And I think it's really, really interesting to unpack that. And there's been some very high level cases of public. I remember being in Uganda a number of years back, and there had been a number of murders of women. Bodies left public, and the narrative on the telly. I remember sitting in the lobby of the hotel and hearing, we're putting in place a curfew for women. I'm thinking, I can see why you've gotten there, but this is, we need to call in to check what's informed that decision. And this is a state decision, and I get it and I understand the want to protect, but this isn't the right way forward. So I think, really, really working to unpack all of those so that we can catch ourselves when we have those thoughts, but equally that we can catch each other. And hold each other to account. And by each other, I mean as individuals in our society, but also as institutions. How do we hold that to account? That's not the right response. That's not the right focus. We're going the wrong path there if we take that approach. I'll pause there. I can talk a lot when I get talking about this issue.
No, thank you. And Reggie, I remember being one of your students sitting in that room, raising my hand. And now, having lived in the United States and being in Ireland, where there are so many public cases that are happening right now, realizing I still, I'm checking myself and people are continuously leaving men unchecked. So it is such a shared experience.
Well, and that's just listening to Deirdre's response, right? Like, there's part of it in the public space that you were talking about. Another aspect of this, right, is men not checking other men. Men watching men be very inappropriate. When I was your teacher, I was also moonlighting as a bartender, right? And you can watch a whole room and you can see who's very clearly inebriated, and then you can watch as men jockey for position to be oh, I'm going to talk to her at my bar. I'm oh, you're absolutely not. That's not what we're going to do here, right? But there is the whole field really of domestic violence, sexual assault, all our advocacies, programs and agencies and stuff. We have a problem, right? Institutionally, where we are saying we are holistically looking at this problem, right? To me, holistically means you are looking at the whole thing. And yet, because we're such a survivor-focused industry, if you will, what we're not doing is looking at the perpetrator, the reason that makes our industry an industry, right? We are content to stand at a single point in the river and pull drowning people out and get them to shore and get them okay and whatever. But what we're not doing decidedly is going upstream and dealing with why people are drowning in the first place, right? So most agencies, especially the way, you get funded here in America, I don't know if it's the same in Ireland, but, you get these like requests for funds or whatever, and they have target populations and whatever. And you can't work with abusers, you can't work with bullies, you can't work with this, right? So all we're doing really is reacting to the situation, right? Instead of responding to the situation by being like, okay, like what are the risk factors here? What is going on that is making this happen at such a large rate, right? So I think a lot of it, especially on an institutional level, right, is like recognizing the insane amount of chauvinism and misogyny that runs our carceral systems, that runs our Congresses, that runs our Senates, all of it, right? Because it is baked in to all the cultures, right? It is like, it is just how it's been, like whatever, under what, who cares? The issue to address, right, is like the entitlement that Deirdre was talking about. Like, not only like am I doing this because I can, but I'm doing it because I can. No one will stop me, right? And the only time it's bad is if I get caught, right? Because everyone knows somebody who's been raped, but not everyone will say they know a rapist, which is really weird math to me.
Absolutely. I'm going to move on to our next question. We'll add to this discussion. You both have spoken about the model of responding to support survivors in healing. We also need to focus on preventing DSGBV. Have you any thoughts on what effective prevention looks like?
If I might come in there, Brady, and I'm just going to pick up, Reggie, from some of the themes in your last answer. And I think for the challenge is, and I do think that this is a challenge that comes with a world of patriarchal systems, and a world in which misogyny runs so high, is that we're often kept so busy that we don't get to take that, bigger view. We're so busy responding all the time. And I do think it's a function and a tactic of patriarchy, in my own opinion. If we keep them all really, really busy over there, they mightn't have time to really address the problem. So I think that can be a challenge. I would really love at this point just to ground us into that real survivor-centred model of working. And I suppose I spoke at the outset about that experience of being in West Darfur, of listening to the narrative. I was a trained nurse, I was a trained midwife, but I really knew I did not know how to respond effectively, how to support the women that were showing up in the health clinic where we were supporting women and children with malnutrition. Finding it shocking that there weren't significant levels of disclosures in that space, given the bigger prevailing picture. And I left and thought, I need to really learn this. There are models of good practice. The women's aids, the rape crisis services, they have them. So I really wanted to embed into that and to learn. And I suppose what I'll say is there's no one path. There's no one size fits all for survivors in this. There is only the path that feels right for the individual survivor themselves. But I think what there is core to all good response programming is a set of principles and underpinnings that guide it. And the core principles that have to be present for that response programming to be good, to be impactful, and to be effective are survivor-centred. The survivor is always at the centre. We are there in service of the survivor. We are there and we are accountable to the survivor. Safety. So everything we do should create safety. And I don't just mean physical safety, I mean emotional, mental, psychological safety. Confidentiality cannot be absent in this. It's not an option. Dignity and respect, non-discrimination and non-judgment. And by doing these, what you are doing is you're creating a model of empowerment that offers the exact opposite of an experience of violence. It never blames, it never shames. it models the right for survivors to choose what feels right for them. It doesn't allow for shoulds or should nots. I mean, and we've a phraseology that comes out. You heard it so much growing up. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. You know, you should report that now because he'll do that to someone else. What feels right for you? That's not someone's responsibility. That's not a woman's responsibility. If that's what feels right, and we can offer the effective supports, and hopefully the systems can respond, then that might feel like the right way. So what you're trying to do is you're offering that acceptance of the person as they are, of their experience. You're not judging, you're not blaming. And all of these things offer the exact opposite of the loss of control, the loss of ability to make a choice in that moment of that violent act. And that's what gives it real power. All of this work has to be firmly underpinned by feminist analysis and principles. And if it moves away from that, I've seen it do harm. And I think that that's really important. And I'm going to use that way, to segue into the prevention piece. I think the field of prevention is one that's been growing in recent years. There's been a huge proliferation of prevention programs. And some are really excellent. Some are probably don't do any harm, but maybe they're not doing a huge amount of positive work either. And some of them are harmful. Let's be honest. So we need to listen to what the research is telling us about evidence-based practice in this area, what works, what doesn't work. But I do think that we can't, and Reggie, you've described that perfectly, that down the river, fishing people out, getting upstream. So response programming always has to be in place before we can start prevention programming, because otherwise we're leaving people who are already in the river to drown. That's just not an option. However, long-term response program in the absence of layering in prevention program is also harmful because we're just always going to be downstream. And I think that's really, really important. I think at times where I have seen prevention programming, let's say, go off the tracks, I'll call it, it has what I can see as a clear pivot away from a survivor-centred approach. And I think this is the challenge when it comes to programs that focus on perpetrators and abusers. And I think this might be one of the reasons we haven't, really made that shift, is that very often they can maybe lend themselves, if they move away from their feminist underpinnings and that accountability to women, accountability to survivors and survivor-centeredness, is they can actually they risk buying in to minimising responsibility, to minimising accountability. And I think that that's a challenge. And it's where perhaps, and I know we're going to look at this a little bit as well, is perhaps where a number of different forms of accountability need to come together. Judicial accountability, social accountability, accountability to women and to survivors. And if we don't have those tenets there, it can be really, really tricky. So it can. So I suppose I would, maybe, consent programming, healthy sexual education, healthy relationships, all really important work with youth. Social norms to change those biases and attitudes and be able to support us to call ourselves out and others out are essential parts of prevention programming. And there is some really, really interesting work in the field and evidence in the field. So I think that would be, good for us. And I think that, to unpack more in all of our work.
Like you, I could talk about this for hours, right? And I agree that our response model being survivor-centered is absolutely pivotal. I also think an overhaul of how we are addressing our IEAEP programming and IPV prevention programmings being court-ordered and super expensive and whatever, it's never going to work. And I think why is the fact that when you build this sense of resentment around the healing process, especially for abusers, you're never going to yield results. But at Growing a New Heart, we've actually been for the last few years running the Call for Change helpline. which is 100% confidential and it is 100% voluntary. And folks who are using harm in their intimate partnerships or in community or at work can call, right, and get actual, like, compassionate accountability, right? Like, no one is going to hold your hand and tell you what you're doing okay. People are going to tell you with respect and dignity, like, hey, like, you're being abusive. These are the ways in which you are being abusive, and this is what you could conceivably do to stop doing that, right? And just like we know in, most domestic violence situations specifically, right, we know statistically it's an average of 7 times that you're going to leave and come back and leave and come back. And there's all sorts of reasons, emotional, economic, all sorts of things, right? Like Deirdre was saying, every survivor knows their situation. They're the only expert on their situation, right? But what we are finding with this helpline is that not only are men calling, but men are calling back multiple times. Men are calling back to be like, hey, I'm about to get home. I had a hard day. I'm stressed out. I don't want anything to go down tonight. What do I do? And our responders will talk with them, up to 2 hours. And, teach them self-talk, some coach work, some just really connecting with, like, linking these abusive values that I was talking to and really illustrating them for people by, like, unnormalizing things that, abusers have normalized, like, oh, how about tonight we try and go the whole night without you calling her a bitch, excuse my language. But things of this nature. And we've been fairly successful, and we are now currently in the process of developing with the state of California to start a helpline there. But, like, this is what I mean, like, in full agreement with Deirdre, like, we always have to have our response programs in place. But like she said, prevention has been taking some leaps and bounds over the last few years. And I think that really, like, going upstream and being like, look, we've got a spot where you can come and talk to folks about changing your ways if that's what you want to do, right? And, like, our responders are eminently trained in, dialogues across differences, compassionate accountability, holding space, all for the culmination of being able to sit and hear some of the most horrid things and be able to not collude with them, no, like, yeah, I hear where you're coming from. None of that. Being like, that sounds terrifying. If I was X, that would be horrifying to me. Can you understand how that would be? Right? So by, like, directly naming what these abusive values look like, how they manifest, I think if seeing how California goes and stuff, I think if we could have more programs like this that are directly calling it out and not like the weird little, like, slap in the wrists guys get here, with like Brock Turner, like, oh, let's think about his future. He's an athlete. Like, no, none of that. That's crazy, right? Like, calling it out for what it is and like having, and it's weird having, like, literally been on the survivor side for 20 years, like, doing this work and seeing the little bit amount of change that we've seen in the small time we've been doing it just makes me very optimistic.
Wow, that's an amazing program. It sounds like it's really making a difference. Thank you for sharing. So moving on to a more employer standpoint and how employers can be resources for their employees who are experiencing abuse. What is important for employers to know when faced with an employee in need of support and leave, and how can they break the stigma that surrounds such violence?
Brady, would you mind if I took us back just momentarily?
Oh, absolutely. Go right ahead,
Piece, if you don't mind. I want to say it because I think it's really important that we model all that we do. Reggie, so much of what you say resonates with me and is really, really powerful, but some of it challenges me.
Same.
Yeah, it challenges me. And I just want to name that for the audience as well, because this is the depth of challenging and difficult conversations sometimes that we have to have, and we have to be willing to bring vulnerability and courage into this work. And, you know, I guess maybe if I speak a little bit to what challenges me, is that in my experience, certainly of where we've looked at working with men, it is that it has colluded and bought into their things. So it's really, as I, you know, I was sitting here and I'm going to, you know, the earlier Deirdre would have interjected a lot sooner, Reggie. Oh, how I've grown. But to really, really understand what works, but like, you know, that not colluding, that calling it out, that saying no. And I think then when we move into really learning from programs, I think the piece that I'd like to say is that we learn from the survivors. So we evaluate the programs with what has changed them, not just with the men. And I think that that's a really important part, because that work with men should be in services like of them, absolutely, but of safety for the survivor, the person who directly experiences the violence there. So some programs wouldn't build in that connection with the women, and I think that that's, you know, really, really important to talk about. The other piece, and I'll pick up on the Brock Turner, every country has these cases. And they're followed by what everyone goes, this is our watershed moment. It's the never again. And then we're back there 6 months' time, 3 months' time, maybe even only a month's time sometimes. And I think that this is where I come to accountability at the level of the institutions of our society and of our states. And a really interesting a couple, but I'll use one case to demonstrate this. And I don't often bring in specific individuals because I want to honour their stories. But there was a young Irish woman living in Australia in 2012, went out after work for drinks with friends, left to walk home to the apartment that she shared with her husband. And within the 10 minutes from the place where she left her friends to her home, she was assaulted, brutally raped and murdered. This work is tough, so it is. And what unfolded after that was the perpetrator of that crime had been repeatedly before the courts for crimes of sexual violence against women, and his sentences had repeatedly been inadequate. There was a reason potentially why they had been inadequate, because the women he had previously targeted were working sex workers, prostitutes. So they held less value in the hierarchy of value in our world. So the justice system didn't hold him to account for it. The first thing this woman's husband did was took a case against the state of failure to protect. It fundamentally changed the legislative landscape because the state were found responsible for failing to protect his wife and being complicit in her murder. And this is the level of accountability that's needed. There's a really interesting case in Uganda where an organisation, an NGO, took a case against the state of failure to protect for a significant group of young girls who all repeatedly reported experiences of abuse and sexual violence, and nothing was done. And we have to be accountable at every level, accountable to ourselves, to each other, and our institutions have to be accountable. And I think that this is what is needed for us to move to a world. We have this phraseology of zero tolerance. Let's be real. Getting there means that we call it out, as you say, at every point, Reggie. We never accept it. We never buy into the minimising that many perpetrators are adept at, to the blaming. It wouldn't have happened if you made me do it. You know, it's because of this. All of that we can unpack when we have the ability to say, this is not acceptable, this is wrong, and this is harming somebody. And we've done it in other issues in terms of social accountability. It is absolutely no longer acceptable in Ireland to get into your car while you have had a few drinks and should drive. And if you do, there is strict legislation that will take you to account there. We can do this, but we can only do it if every member of our society can row in behind, because our institutions, and this takes me to the answer, Brady, around employers, our institutions are merely replicas of our society. I don't stop being who I am when I walk through the door of work. I carry all of my socializations, all of my beliefs, my values that society has embedded in me, and they will come to play there. So it will manifest in institutions, and we need to offer the support to people there. For me, it starts within institutions by, and for employers, being your particular focus, by ensuring that we have the policies and practices in place that tell someone it's safe to seek support if you need it. And by ensuring we have the training in place that means that when Deirdre says this to a colleague or to a manager, to someone else in the workplace, that the response can be compassionate, empathetic and understanding, not try to fix it all, not reinforce any of the harmful narratives, and connect with supports for the specialist services, because employers don't need to be specialists in this. And I think going, not trying to fix it or reinvent the wheel, but for institutions, whether that's, employers, the judiciary, police forces, which are all employees and employers, it is them accessing specialist training from specialist agencies who know this work, and not, sending off someone from HR who's never worked in the area, never interfaced with survivors, to do a 30-minute information session and then we've ticked that box. That's not how this happens. You have to really embed that. So training, policy, and the culture of you'll be heard, you'll be believed, and we'll connect you to the supports that can help you on your journey.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think, here it is the same thing. It's like a box to be checked. Like, we're going to do your little intake. Kathy, who's never worked with a survivor before, is going to ask you a bunch of invasive questions and then send you on your way. That's not going to cut it. I think the amount of specialized training, or even having your employer have a relationship with your local domestic violence agency, so that it's not like a surprise, no one's caught flat-footed. We look at our numbers and we know that this is happening overwhelmingly, right? So we should be prepared to help do what we can in response. I think another aspect of this too is I'm a big proponent for universal basic income, right? As well as having an employer, because then if I do need to leave, I'm not, where am I going to get the $7,500 to have first, last, and security for a new apartment for me and the kids, right? There's a lot of factors that you are going to deal with if someone comes to you and discloses, depending on what they want to do about the situation, right? If they want to leave, that's a big move. Here in the States, Brady, getting an apartment in our county right now is almost impossible, right? So this is sort of in line with the rhetoric around, well, why do they stay? And whatever, like we were talking about before, every survivor knows their situation better than anyone. They know what level of lethality their situation may or may not be at. They also know what other factors go into it. If a man will harm his partner, he will harm a dog, he will harm a cat, he will harm a child, he will, right? So it's this is a multi-tiered thing, and there should be, I believe employers should have a multi-tiered response, right? Depending on how large your business is, your agency, whatever it is. If you can float having an apartment on retainer, right? That is just for crisis. If someone does need to get away for a few days, you know what I mean? I think and letting situations resolve themselves and letting the time that it takes for it to happen, and not like, okay, well, we can give you 3 days and then we're going to like need to see you back on the clock. Was like, not everything works like that, right? Like you don't get to access all the services you need, during the work day, during work hours. Like you don't get the responses or the callbacks. So I think being compassionate and empathetic, as well as fiscally prepared and willing to actually like be there for your employees, is another large part of it.
Absolutely. That is a great segue into my next question, actually. So, since the pandemic, we have seen an increase in people working from home. One could say that previously the office was a place of sanctuary for those being abused at home. How can employers be better aware of signs that their remote employees are in need of help, and what is the best approach for them to reach out?
I think, again, this goes back to training and actually like knowing what to look for. Like we saw our numbers skyrocket during the lockdown. And then we actually found out it was more than that, because then folks were coming back in for services after the lockdown was over and couldn't report during the lockdown, right? I think this one is a tricky one, right? Because it is, you are in people's homes. You don't want to like assume, you don't want to like, so like outside of an abjectly abusive relationship, right? Like people can have a relationship that's awful as long as both parties are reliably safe, right? It is everyone's choice to be in a bad relationship if they want, right? So it's like, far be it from me to like look through your Zoom screen and see something that may be perfectly normal in your house. It's just not normal in mine, but it's not abusive. It could be destructive. It could be fraying the bond between you and your partner, but that's not for me, right? So like as a casual observer, that would be really hard to determine. Having 15 years of experience in this field, it would still be a little hard for me to determine. There are some things that are very clear cut, right? Like we know, like if you see someone get physically hit, yes, clear cut, clear case. However, emotionally, psychologically, right, the different forms of abuse look so different. And it is so hard, I think, for someone who is not specially trained in this field, to be able to like assess a situation through a Zoom call unless it was very, very obvious. So like, I think this just kind of goes back to our last set of answers, where like, if someone does come and, they're like, look, I know I've been, working remotely from home for the last however, but like, I need you to know what's going on, is again, that like compassionate, embracing of like, hey, we believe you. Like, what can we do to help you? What do you want done? Right. And like always, options, not advice. Like, I like hammer that home, because I see so many times like someone will disclose or report, and that one like real gung-ho friend who, you need to do this, you need to do it right now, because you don't know what's going on, right? And that's in person. So like the Zoom thing does make it much, much more difficult. I feel like, I don't know, Deirdre, you may agree or disagree, but I feel like assessing through Zoom is a tricky and slippery slope.
Yeah, I actually, I would agree, Reggie, and I don't think that I'm necessarily best placed, because my core focus isn't kind of employer to answer it, but maybe what I would talk about here is maybe what I'd say the pitfall when, sometimes a little information, and people take a little information and they think they know it all, and that's a big pitfall. Quite so much as the people who don't know what they don't know is really what you're seeing in it. But I think cultivating an environment where people know that it is safe to reach out for support should they wish to and need to is the key. And then trusting that people will. And, in my experience, disclosures come in many ways. You have a planned disclosure where someone says, I've been chatting with Brady, over Zoom or in the workplace, and I think I could talk to her, and I think I could trust her with this. So there'll be what I call the test, a little you test to see how you might respond. An awful lot of survivors' first experiences of disclosures will be highly negative, and it will be that gung-ho response, or that response that is read as blaming them and will push them back into not disclosing, potentially for a significant amount of time. A disclosure is a moment of crisis in managing the situation. And if it's handled well, it can accelerate a person's journey to safety. But if it's not, it can totally entrench them back in coping strategies that aren't working for them anymore. So there's planned disclosures. There's also what I'll call a forced disclosure. This is where a person does not plan to disclose this, but something happens that makes it visible to other people, and other people start to ask questions and to probe and to say, you know, I'm concerned, I'm worried, I think that's wrong. And that can be really difficult. That can happen when someone is admitted to hospital because of an assault. It's a forced disclosure. They're not choosing that disclosure. And that can feel, again, if we think of that control, that taking away of control that the violence does, that forced disclosure can feel like a real loss of control. And not least because the risk heightens hugely when a survivor seeks support. This is where we have fatal outcomes. The most fatal outcomes occur when someone is planning to leave a relationship that is abusive, or in the immediate period having left that relationship. And that's really, really, you know, important that we bear that in mind. And that's where the specialist agencies are so crucial. They get this, you know, it takes time to get there, but you're not saying you should do this. You're actually going, what would feel right? How do you think he'll respond if you do that? And you're running risk analysis the whole time, safety planning the whole time. You know, if the response to what you think will happen, if you say that to him, if you take this action, he will kill me. I want to listen to that. And now I want to understand a little bit more about why you feel that. And we're probably dealing with very high risk here. You only ever have, and I'll finish on this point, when working with a survivor, it is a privilege and an honour to be trusted with that disclosure. That is an absolute privilege and an honour. And with that comes a huge responsibility to honour that. But irrespective of the disclosure, and again, the earlier Deirdre in this field would have thought because somebody disclosed to me, I knew everything about their situation. The more grown up Deirdre has come to know that it's like a jigsaw. And I might only have 2 out of 50 pieces of that story. There will be so much that is still held deeply within the person that they don't wish to disclose, don't wish to talk about, are not ready to talk about. So if I take actions into that relationship, I put that person at risk. So absolutely always taking the lead, and the support from specialist agencies here is really, really important.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. Do either of you have any final thoughts?
I just want to say, like, this topic, I feel like folks who are in this field, like, we are in this field for a long time because, like, we are passionate about this and we, you know, want to help folks. Deirdre, I just want to say thank you so much. Much like you know what I mean? Like, the old Reggie would have, like, sat here and argued and, like, whatever. But I think for me, like, what you just said about the jigsaw is the most important thing, right? Like, you sometimes may only have 2 pieces of a 100-piece puzzle, a 50-piece puzzle, right? And I think that, like, that level of humility, right, is so important for anyone who is in this field, is thinking about going into this field, to do this work and help us end this global crisis that is happening. So that's really what it is when you look at the numbers.
Yeah. And I think, you know, likewise, I think just, you know, I suppose that we're sitting here talking to each other, but there's people going to be listening to this podcast, the audience, and that's where my mind goes right now. And I suppose to anyone listening, that this triggers anything for. You know, I'm sure the Tools for Better, I think it'd be really important to offer some support service details. This issue impacts everyone directly and indirectly. There's very few people that will live their lives and not be impacted by it personally. And I think, you know, for me, it is this idea of, let us always follow our words with actions and with accountability. Let us be courageous and vulnerable. I will never apologise for getting upset when I talk about this issue, even after 30 years, because if I don't, and if I harden to it, then I'm not the right person for it anymore. And I think that that's really important. You know, together we are stronger, and together we can all make a difference on this. And that's what we have to do to address an issue of this magnitude. And also to not accept that it will take a long time. It's already taken a long time. Come on. You know, it's time now to really push through this. It's time to really start taking everything we've learned, everything we know that works, and we need to absolutely push through to the finish line and create a world that is more safe, more fair, and more equal for women and children. It's just so important.
Well, again, a heartfelt thank you to you both for such a powerful and important conversation. And keep an eye out for Tools for the Better for our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brady.